Crowdfunding is a hot term in venture capital these days. We've talked about it a lot on the show. It lets startups solicit from individual investors, raise money, and usually online. Now, in the past, there have always been restrictions on how startups could raise money, with the idea to protect the average investor, make sure that that person knows just how risky an investment could be. The recently signed Jobs Act loosened some of the marketing restrictions, making it easier for entrepreneurs to raise money directly from individual investors. Our next guest thinks this crowdfunding, a part of the Jobs Act, is a terrible idea. Daniel Isenberg is with us now. He is a management professor at Babson Global, a training ground for entrepreneurs. He joins us now from our Boston bureau. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us here on Money Moves. I have heard you say in the past, I read your blog, the Jobs Act is great. The crowdfunding part of it is terrible. Why is that?
Well, I do agree that in general, I think the Jobs Act really is good, and it's only the equity aspect of the crowdfunding that I think is going to be a very serious problem. I think it's, with the best intentions in the world, I think it's going to have the end result of misleading investors.
Daniel, I've heard some people say, and I know this doesn't speak directly to your point about investors being misled, but if I've gone through the fine print, some of our experts, some of our guests, they say the most that someone can lose is $2,000 on any one given investment. I'm not saying that's negligible, but nor is it that person's house or car or other items that could change that person's life.
No, that's not the actual numbers. For small, low net worth individuals, it's 5% of their net worth, so up to $5,000, and for high net worth, it's 10%, up to $100,000.
So it can get
big. But you're right,
fast.
It does protect. There's some downside protection in it. I think there's a question whether or not, again, unintentionally misleading large numbers of people for small amounts of money is still a reasonable thing to do to the public.
And I think, as some of our VC experts have pointed out, people who are in the field, it's a pretty tough business, and it may not be for amateurs. One thing in particular that was quoted to me is that when you're first getting involved in backing businesses, you think that 90% of the concept, or rather, you have to believe in it 90%, and that the concept is the most important thing, whereas there's tons of other factors to consider. The average investor may not realize that.
Yes. Well, I think it's more complicated than that, because in the early stages of, by the way, I'm not just a professor. I'm a very active angel investor. I've been a venture capitalist, and I've also been an entrepreneur for 15 years. So when I work with governments on entrepreneurship policy, I look at things from a variety of perspectives. But I think it's more complex than that. In the very early stages of investing, and I don't think a lot of people necessarily know this, is investors and entrepreneurs have misaligned interests. What's good for investors is bad for entrepreneurs, and vice versa. It's only in the long run that a win-win situation is created. And so the complexity of aligning those interests to allow the investors to invest, I think, makes it almost impossible to standardize the equity crowdfunding process. And the standardization is one of the only ways that this could possibly work.
Daniel, enlighten us as far as the two biggest hang-ups. So one from the investor side, one from the entrepreneur side, where you say there's the most possibility for each other to miss the boat.
Well, I mentioned complexity, but there are a couple of other aspects that I think are what I call fatal flaws. One is that equity is forever. Equity crowdfunding looks on the surface like the donation crowdfunding, the Kickstarters, the Indiegogos, which are really very successful, but they're based on donations, or product development, getting samples of products, etc. But underneath, they're really fundamentally different. And one of the differences is that, and like a diamond, equity is forever. You're buying a piece of property, you have a claim on that property forever. You hand it down to your grandchildren. You could. And so the problems with that property that you can't really study carefully, you don't really know what you're buying. It's impossible. It won't become visible until very, very much later. So that's a second problem. And in order to solve that problem, what we did as venture capitalists, what most venture capitalists do, is they spend a very large amount of time and money in doing what we call due diligence. They investigate the markets, talk to customers, reference checks, etc. And that cost is going to be prohibitive for raising very small amounts of money. So I don't think the due diligence is possible either. And then the final fatal flaw, Deirdre, I think, is that the assumption that there's a wisdom of crowds. Now, I have a PhD in social psychology. I did my dissertation on how groups influence individual decision-making, and there's tremendous amounts of evidence. My bookshelves are full of books which show that crowds can take very smart people and end up with irrational outcomes.
Sure.
You know, there are
to
many
the tulip,
examples of this.
the tulips in Holland.
The tulip craze, Kitty Genovese, the subprime mortgage, if anybody remembers that, not very long ago.
Daniel, we thank you so much. Thank you very much. Keep writing the great blogs. They're good reading. Daniel Isenberg joining us there, a management professor at Babson Global, training ground for entrepreneurs.